In every war, the maps we see are drawn with borders, arrows, and battles, but there is always another map that never reaches the light. One etched in secrecy, in burned pages and vanished voices. Imagine locked vaults where fragments of reports lie under dust, coded names carved into margins no one dares to read aloud. Somewhere in those silences, forgotten convoys move through frozen forests. Voices speak through ghost signals on empty seas, and experiments breathe in shadows, long after the smoke of battle clears. These are not stories of parades or victories. They are the hidden corridors behind the war, places where morality was folded and sealed away with the files. Step too close, and the paper begins to smolder. The ink whispers back, and history itself feels like it is resisting you. You are not supposed to be here, not supposed to hear this, but once the door is opened, there is no turning away. Chapter 1. Shadows Beneath Operation Paperclip. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed under relentless Allied bombardment, another war unfolded in the shadows. It was a war not of tanks and artillery, but of intelligence cables, transport manifests, and sealed dossiers. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union understood that victory in Europe was only a prelude to a larger confrontation, one that would be fought with rockets, intelligence networks, and technologies still in their infancy. At the heart of this covert struggle lay Operation Paperclip, the program designed to extract and conceal Nazi scientists before the Soviets could seize them. The public record describes it as a mission to recruit engineers for America's rocket program, yet buried in classified annexes and long-withheld memoranda is a darker dimension, one involving bioweapons trials, chemical warfare experiments, and scientists whose crimes were never brought before the tribunals at Nuremberg. On June 20, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in Frankfurt received a priority communication labeled Eyes Only. The document, signed by Colonel James P. Newman of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, outlined the immediate need to secure all technical personnel connected to V-weapons development, chemical warfare divisions, and medical research for potential relocation to controlled territories. By relocation, the memorandum meant extraction to American-run camps in Bavaria, where identities were scrubbed and dossiers sanitized before the scientists were placed aboard military transports bound for the United States. Many were known members of the SS, some holding ranks in the Totenkopfverbände, yet their affiliations were quietly erased, replaced with innocuous descriptions such as aeronautical engineer or chemistry consultant. One of the most unsettling files was that of Dr. Kurt Blome, former Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich. Blome had overseen programs in biological warfare, experimenting with plague and anthrax on concentration camp prisoners. According to a July 1945 OSS report, he was captured in a Bavarian farmhouse with 2 crates of documents marked Versuchsfeld, or testing field. The crates vanished into US custody, their contents never disclosed in trial records. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Blome was acquitted at Nuremberg. In 1947, he surfaced again in Maryland at Fort Detrick, where American officers referred to him only as Consultant K. His assignment, advising on defensive measures against Soviet germ warfare. No public record of his work exists beyond redacted budget entries, yet in an archived Pentagon briefing dated December 12, 1948, his initials appear beside a notation. Review complete. Proceed with field deployment simulation, Nevada sector. The most visible face of Paperclip became Werner von Braun, the charismatic rocket engineer who had overseen the V-2 program. Yet even von Braun's record was carefully reconstructed. A secret report filed by the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, in September 1946 documented his SS membership, his presence at Mittelwerk where slave laborers were worked to death building V-weapons, and his personal knowledge of executions carried out against prisoners. The report was stamped classified, not to be released, and was buried in army archives until fragments were uncovered by investigative journalists decades later. Instead, von Braun became the sanitized figurehead of America's new space program, his past locked away under the same vaults that stored Blome's files. But it was not only rocket scientists and medical researchers who slipped into American custody. A string of lesser-known names, many tied to intelligence operations, were ferried quietly across the Atlantic. Reinhard Gehlen, once Hitler's chief of Eastern Front intelligence, struck a deal with US intelligence in 1945, agreeing to provide his vast network of informants against the Soviets in exchange for immunity. His organization, known as the Gehlen Org, became a cornerstone of the CIA's early operations, staffed with men whose wartime careers included hunting partisans and orchestrating reprisals. What began as a pragmatic arrangement metastasized into a permanent apparatus, embedding former Nazi officers into the very fabric of Western intelligence. Declassified fragments from the CIA's own records reveal that many of these men were relocated not only to the United States, but to South America. A 1951 memorandum marked Restricted Paperclip South referenced a series of transfers routed through Buenos Aires and São Paulo, where scientists were given new identities and assigned to cooperative laboratories. Why the relocation occurred remains unclear, though one theory advanced by historians is that Washington sought to obscure their presence from both Congress and the press. By the mid-1950s, these operations were so well concealed that even internal CIA auditors struggled to track funding, leading to entire projects labeled simply black budget, technical. The most disturbing indications of Paperclip's hidden agenda lie in testimonies buried within the US Army's chemical core files. A report from WWII Proving Ground dated May 2, 1949, described experiments involving aerosol dispersal methods designed to simulate anthrax clouds over desert terrain. Attached to the file were personnel rosters containing names of German specialists previously thought to have been executed or imprisoned. At least 2 had documented ties to the same facilities where prisoners had been subjected to live agent testing during the war. The experiments were justified in the report as necessary precautions against Soviet offensive capabilities, but no mention was made of the ethical or legal implications. President Truman, who formally authorized Paperclip, was never fully briefed on the extent of what was being imported. Meeting notes from a White House security session on September 3, 1946, reveal his frustration when presented with sanitized summaries. "I will not authorize war criminals," he reportedly remarked. Yet the selection committees had already doctored files to obscure affiliations. By the time Truman learned the scope of what was underway, hundreds of scientists had already been relocated, their pasts erased. The final chapter of Paperclip remains concealed in sealed archives and redacted case files. But what emerges from the fragments available is a picture not of a clean scientific transfer, but of a deliberate cover-up, one designed to harvest knowledge no matter how it was obtained. The official story presented to the public was one of technological progress, the rockets that carried man into space, the breakthroughs in medicine and aviation. Yet beneath the triumph lay a ledger of erased crimes, unacknowledged victims, and secret experiments conducted under the banner of national security. In 1977, a congressional inquiry briefly reopened the question of Paperclip. Testimonies revealed that at least 70 men recruited under the program had been implicated in human experimentation. Their names, however, were withheld, and the hearings concluded with no action taken. To this day, many of the files remain classified, sealed until dates that stretch far into the future. The story of Operation Paperclip is not merely the tale of rockets and scientists, but of deliberate amnesia. It is a history written in blacked-out paragraphs, in airfields where SS men walked free under new names, in laboratories where the line between defense and atrocity blurred. The war may have ended in 1945, but for those brought across under Paperclip, their real work had only just begun, hidden in plain sight. Their crimes dissolved into the classified shadows of the Cold War. Chapter 2. The Baltic Submarine Disappearance Files. In the tense early years of the Cold War, the waters of the Baltic Sea became one of the most contested maritime spaces on Earth. It was here, in October 1952, that NATO listening posts along the German coast registered a set of anomalous transmissions, the kind no one expected to hear again. They matched the encrypted signaling patterns once used by the Kriegsmarine's advanced Type 21 U-boats, vessels officially destroyed or surrendered by 1945. The discovery set off a chain of classified investigations, now known only by fragments preserved in British Admiralty archives under the title Case 341. What began as a routine signal intercept quickly evolved into one of the Cold War's most enduring maritime mysteries, involving missing officers, unexplained disappearances, and a submerged legacy of the Third Reich that neither East nor West could publicly acknowledge. The Type 21 had been the most advanced submarine of its time. Nicknamed the Electro Boot, it represented a leap in naval warfare, with high-capacity batteries and streamlined hulls that allowed longer submerged operations than any Allied equivalent. Allied intelligence had spent the final months of the war hunting these vessels, fearing they could disrupt Atlantic supply routes. By the time Germany surrendered, most were scuttled, captured, or taken into Soviet custody. Yet, according to an internal memorandum from the Royal Navy's Submarine Service, dated November 14, 1952, unidentified signals utilizing 9.6 MHz, bearing characteristics consistent with Kriegsmarine U-boat cipher transmission, were triangulated in the vicinity of Gotland Island. The memo was stamped with the instruction, immediate suppression, no distribution beyond flag officers. Local accounts complicated matters further. Swedish fishermen reported sighting periscopes in October, their positions marked just north of Visby. One testimony, taken by the Swedish Coast Guard and later shared in secret with British officials, described a black-hulled submarine rising briefly above the surface before slipping back into the depths without running lights. The report was quietly filed away, marked unsubstantiated. Yet NATO hydrophones in the same region registered cavitation noise consistent with a submerged vessel of considerable size. By mid-November, the signals ceased altogether, as if the phantom submarine had vanished. Speculation among Western analysts quickly turned to Soviet salvage operations. After 1945, the USSR had taken possession of several Type 21 hulls, refitting them into the basis of its new submarine fleet. However, discrepancies in Soviet naval logs, particularly the unexplained disappearance of German officers originally assigned to assist Soviet engineers, raised suspicions that something more clandestine had taken place. A declassified CIA field report from 1953, originating in Berlin, mentioned a rumor circulating among former Kriegsmarine officers. A fully operational Type 21 had been hidden from Allied capture. Its crew pledged to continue operations long after the Reich's surrender. The rumor, dismissed publicly, nevertheless made its way into restricted intelligence summaries. The missing officers became another thread in the story. At Flensburg in May 1945, Allied forces had compiled detailed rosters of surrendered personnel. Yet when compared with Soviet records unearthed in the 1990s, a dozen senior engineers and commanders from the U-boat fleet appeared absent from both surrender lists and prisoner rolls. One name, Kapitän Leutnant Erich Behrens, stood out. Behrens had commanded experimental patrols in the Baltic during the final months of the war. According to British intelligence interrogations, he was last seen in April 1945, departing Gottenhafen with orders to relocate sensitive equipment. His fate remains unknown. Classified files from NATO's Standing Group in 1953 noted the strategic implications of the incident. If the Soviets possess an intact WWII-class vessel, Western anti-submarine warfare capabilities will be rendered obsolete in the northern seas, the report warned. The possibility of Soviet control was deeply feared, yet internal disagreements plagued the assessment. Some British analysts argued the signals were decoys, part of an elaborate Soviet psychological operation to sow paranoia. Others insisted too many technical details matched the original Kriegsmarine cipher systems to be dismissed. In the absence of hard evidence, Case 341 was quietly closed, though it continued to circulate in restricted naval circles for decades. Hints of a deeper cover-up appeared in 1961, when a retired Royal Navy cryptographer, speaking off-record to a journalist, mentioned that fragments of the intercepted transmissions had survived. They contained call signs once assigned to the U-3514, a Type 21 vessel officially scuttled by its crew in May 1945 at Hamburg. Admiralty documents confirm the wreck was inspected by Allied forces and declared irretrievable. If the call signs were genuine, it suggested either a sophisticated forgery or that at least one vessel had evaded destruction. The cryptographer's remarks were swiftly denied by the Admiralty, and the journalist's piece was never published. Soviet archives released after 1991 shed limited light on the matter. Files from the Baltic Fleet Command did reference salvage operations near Gotland in late 1952, but all details of what was recovered were redacted, replaced by bureaucratic language citing strategic materials of continuing sensitivity. Russian naval historians who reviewed the files believe something significant was indeed recovered, though whether it was an intact submarine, components, or simply wreckage remains unresolved. What remains most disturbing are the human fragments that surface in the record. Between 1950 and 1955, West German police recorded several cases of former Kriegsmarine officers disappearing without trace. Families reported sudden relocations, cryptic farewell letters, and in one case, a last postcard from Lübeck with a simple message: "The work continues." These disappearances were never linked officially to naval activity, yet within the German veteran community, whispers persisted that certain men had been called back to complete unfinished duties. In the context of the Cold War, the Baltic submarine mystery took on an even darker significance. The West feared a hidden continuity of Nazi military assets aligning with Soviet interests, while Moscow likely feared the same of Western exploitation. The sea itself became the graveyard of truth, concealing whether a relic of Hitler's navy still prowled beneath. By 1955, both sides had compelling reasons to bury the story. For NATO, admitting the existence of an operational German submarine 7 years after surrender would have undermined confidence in Allied control. For the Soviets, revealing they had captured and deployed such a vessel would have provoked international scrutiny and potentially escalated tensions beyond containment. Today, what remains of Case 341 is scattered. Redacted Admiralty memos, declassified CIA reports with entire sections missing, and oral testimonies from fishermen and sailors who saw something they were not supposed to. The Baltic remains a sea of wrecks, its floor littered with corroded steel. Yet among these ruins lies the question that has never been fully answered. Did a Type 21 submarine, one of the most advanced weapons of Nazi Germany, survive beyond 1945 and continue its mission into the Cold War? For historians, the answer lies not only in archives, but in what those archives deliberately conceal. The Baltic submarine disappearance files are a reminder of how easily truth can be scuttled, hidden beneath layers of secrecy, until what survives is less history than whispered rumor. The war ended in May 1945, but in the cold depths of the Baltic, the echoes of encrypted transmissions in 1952 suggest that some chapters of that conflict never truly concluded. Chapter 3: Ghost Convoys of the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front in the winter of 1945 was chaos embodied. Soviet artillery thundered across East Prussia, and the Wehrmacht retreated in tatters. Yet amid the destruction, a series of convoys departed under orders so secret that even senior officers were left in the dark. These were not supply columns carrying reinforcements or munitions. They were Sondertransport convoys, marked with insignia designating special operations. According to declassified OSS intercepts, the orders originated from SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, the man entrusted with Hitler's most advanced weapons projects. Known for his ruthless efficiency and his oversight of both the V-2 rocket program and secret underground production facilities, Kammler directed that the convoys disappear into the forest near the Masurian lakes, their cargoes never to be recovered by the advancing Red Army. What they carried has remained a mystery, shielded by vanished witnesses, redacted Soviet reports, and CIA interrogations years later that only deepened the intrigue. The first credible reference to these convoys comes from a Soviet field report dated January 28, 1945, preserved in fragments within Russian Central Archives. It describes skirmishes near the town of Ortelsburg, where Red Army patrols engaged German trucks escorted by armoured half-tracks. The firefight ended with the Germans retreating into the woods, abandoning burning vehicles but leaving behind no identifiable cargo. The Soviet commander noted in his log, "Boxes and crates loaded with unusual markings, units instructed to seal the site." Subsequent directives issued from Moscow to redact further reporting. No photographs or inventories remain, though local peasants recalled columns of smoke rising from the forest and heavily armed Germans digging at night. By February, the Wehrmacht in East Prussia was collapsing. Yet Kammler's convoys, often travelling at night and under heavy guard, continued to vanish along unmarked roads. Witness testimony collected by Polish villagers decades later described trucks laden with wooden crates, each stenciled with the letters EK, a code name later discovered in CIA files to stand for Earl König, a cryptonym associated with Kammler's evacuation orders. Villagers recalled soldiers warning them away at gunpoint, claiming the convoys carried state property for the Führer. In one case, a farmer recounted watching as crates were loaded onto barges and ferried across a frozen lake before disappearing into the tree line. The Red Army arrived days later to find nothing but tire tracks in the snow. American intelligence began piecing together these fragments in the early 1950s. Debriefing report from 1953 records the testimony of a captured German officer, Major Wilhelm Haas, who had served under Kammler. Haas described maps marked with hidden depots across East Prussia and Pomerania. The convoys carried research, not treasure, he told interrogators, his words typed into the CIA summary. Materials from Mittelwerk, files from Peenemünde, prototypes too valuable to fall into Russian hands. Haas insisted that Kammler himself supervised the first of these convoys before disappearing in April 1945. His testimony was considered credible enough that the CIA attached copies of the maps to classified annexes, though the coordinates were heavily redacted in subsequent releases. Soviet records, too, hinted at the significance of the convoys. A KGB file from 1959, revealed after the collapse of the USSR, referenced enemy transport columns carrying technological property of high priority, removed under code L. König. The file described firefights between Red Army units and unknown formations that refused to surrender, continuing to resist weeks after Hitler's death. Curiously, these formations were never identified as regular Wehrmacht divisions, suggesting they were specialized SS detachments with orders to fight to the last man. Their sacrifice appears to have bought enough time for the convoys to complete their mission. The question remained, where did they go? Excavations conducted in Masseria during the 1960s uncovered abandoned tunnels and bunkers. Some partially collapsed, others flooded. In one site near WWII, investigators found rusted truck frames buried in soil, their cargo long removed. Polish state archives contain reports of strange radiation readings in the area, though these were dismissed as instrumentation errors. Other rumors claim that sealed chambers beneath the forest still contain crates marked Reichseigentum, property of the Reich, untouched since 1945. No formal excavation has ever confirmed these claims, and government restrictions continue to limit access to the most promising sites. The fate of Hans Kammler himself remains another missing piece. Official accounts claim he committed suicide in Czechoslovakia in May 1945. Yet Allied intelligence files contradict this. One OSS cable from June 1945 refers to sightings of Kammler in Bavaria, while a later CIA document lists him as at large, possible transfer to Western custody. Historians argue that Kammler may have been traded in secret, his knowledge of advanced weapons deemed too valuable for trial. If he indeed survived, his role in orchestrating the ghost convoys would have been his final act of loyalty to the Reich, or his bargaining chip with the victors. In the aftermath, the legend of the ghost convoys became entangled with conspiracy and rumor. Some claimed the convoys carried uranium intended for an unfinished German atomic program, spirited away before Soviet troops could seize it. Others suggested advanced jet prototypes or guidance systems later incorporated into Soviet missile technology. A handful of more chilling theories argued that the cargo included documentation of medical and human experiments conducted in concentration camps, records too damning to ever reach a courtroom. With each theory came a trail of missing documents, vanished witnesses, and classified files. By the 1970s, the CIA still listed Operation Erlkönig as an unresolved intelligence matter. A memorandum from 1973 described renewed interest after satellite imagery revealed unusual ground disturbances in northern Poland, near areas associated with Kammler's convoys. Excavation proposals were raised but never acted upon, likely due to diplomatic sensitivities during détente. The files were quietly closed, transferred into long-term storage, and marked for review in 2025. Today, the ghost convoys remain one of the most enduring mysteries of the war's end. Unlike the stolen art treasures of Göring or the gold of the Reichsbank, these convoys were not looted riches but something far more dangerous: knowledge, prototypes, and research that could alter the balance of the Cold War. Whether buried in frozen lakes, sealed in bunkers, or spirited out of Europe entirely, their absence has left a gap in the historical record, a silence filled only by speculation and redacted pages. For those who still search, the convoys are less a historical footnote than a warning. They remind us that the collapse of the Third Reich did not end in neat surrender, but in shadows, trucks disappearing into snowbound forests, guards digging through the night, and crates marked only with cryptic codenames. What was carried away under Kamler's orders may never be fully known, but the echoes of the ghost convoys continue to haunt the Eastern Front, a war within a war whose secrets were buried but never forgotten. Chapter 4. Operation Silver Ash Conspiracy Files. Vienna in 1947 was a city suspended between ruin and intrigue. The war had ended only 2 years earlier, yet the Austrian capital was now divided into occupation zones patrolled by Soviet, American, British and French forces. Bombed-out buildings stood beside cafes where spies traded envelopes, and the air carried the constant tension of a city at the center of Europe's new shadow war. It was here that a seemingly routine interception would open one of the strangest and most unsettling cases of the early Cold War, an affair. Recorded in military archives only under the codename Project Silberasche, or Operation Silver Ash, the first known reference comes from a US counterintelligence Corps CIC incident report dated March 18, 1947. Agents detained 2 couriers on the Danube railway line carrying hollowed-out books filled with rolls of microfilm. The books bore the stamps of a Berlin university library, yet the images inside depicted not literature but detailed plans for assassinations, sabotage, and disruption of Allied-controlled sectors in Vienna. The microfilm reels were labelled in German script, with a cover sheet marked Silberash Phase 1. CIC officers immediately forwarded the material to their headquarters at the Hotel Bristol, where it was photographed, duplicated, and dispatched to Washington under the highest classification. The files themselves remain largely redacted, but surviving fragments suggest that Silver Ash was a clandestine operation created in the dying months of the Reich and revived under Soviet sponsorship. A memorandum written by CIC officer Major John McAdams noted, "Documents describe covert cells activated to destabilize post-war governance. Methods include targeted elimination of officials, arson of supply depots, and staged attacks intended to be blamed on rival occupiers." The sophistication of the plans alarmed US commanders, particularly as the documents referenced agents already embedded within Allied administration offices. British intelligence reached similar conclusions. A cable from the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS station in Vienna, dated April 2, 1947, described the interception as credible evidence of a residual Abwehr, or SS network, potentially reactivated with Soviet support. The message carried a chilling addendum. Suggested targets overlap with recent unexplained incidents in the British zone. Correlation cannot be dismissed. The unexplained incidents included a warehouse fire in Floridsdorf and the stabbing of a railway official suspected of collaborating with Allied security forces. Both events had been attributed to local unrest until the Silver Ash papers surfaced. What unsettled investigators most was the apparent overlap between Silver Ash and Soviet intelligence. The documents contained annotations in Cyrillic script, suggesting review or adaptation by Moscow. One marginal note, translated from Russian, read, "Phase Y approved. Await Phase 2. This fueled suspicions that the Soviets were reviving Nazi sabotage networks as proxy forces, allowing them to destabilize Western zones while maintaining plausible deniability. A Joint Intelligence Committee meeting in London, minutes of which remain partially declassified, described the possibility as an unprecedented fusion of former fascist operatives with communist direction, a convergence that official narratives cannot acknowledge. The reels were catalogued into CIC archives, but soon portions began to disappear. By 1949, at least 2 reels from the Vienna seizure had gone missing. Internal memos recorded growing alarm. Microfilm evidence concerning Silver Ash, designated reels V4 and V6, no longer traceable. Presumed compromised. Investigators suspected inside theft, possibly by double agents within the occupation forces. The missing reels were believed to contain lists of operatives and safe houses, information that could have explained the spate of bombings and unexplained killings that continued to occur across the Balkans through the late 1940s. Meanwhile, Vienna itself remained plagued by shadows. A police file from 1948 describes a series of unexplained bombings targeting the Allied patrol vehicles on the outskirts of the Soviet zone. Though officially attributed to banditry, local witnesses recalled German-speaking men dressed in civilian clothes who vanished into Soviet-controlled streets after the attacks. American officers began using the term silver ash operatives to describe these suspects, though the phrase was never used in public reports. Soviet authorities, when questioned, denied all knowledge of such activities. In a meeting at the Allied Control Council in June 1948, the Soviet delegate dismissed the allegations as Western invention, yet Western delegates privately noted the vehemence of the denial. US intelligence compiled a classified report months later titled Silberasche, Probable Soviet Affiliation, which concluded that the Soviets had every incentive to utilize deniable assets in Vienna, and that the remnants of the Abwehr provided a ready-made infrastructure. By the early 1950s, the trail of silver ash faded into Cold War silence. Files were boxed away, many stamped with "Do not declassify before 2025." Yet small pieces continued to resurface. In 1955, Austrian police investigated a bombing at a rail yard in Graz. Among the debris, they discovered fragments of timing devices resembling those described in the silver ash reels. The case was closed under political pressure, but the investigative notes, preserved in Austrian archives, carried a haunting conclusion. This attack matches previously suppressed patterns of sabotage. It may be linked to networks established during the occupation years. For historians, the gaps in the record are telling. Silver ash is rarely mentioned in declassified Allied files, except in passing references or heavily censored annexes. CIA officers who reviewed the surviving microfilm in the 1950s claimed the documents revealed connections between ex-Abwehr operatives and unexplained killings in Yugoslavia and Greece. Yet once those files were entered into the CIA's archives, they vanished behind decades of redactions. Operation Silver Ash is remembered today not through open records but whispered fragments. Couriers intercepted with hollowed-out books, missing reels of microfilm, sabotage operations attributed to bandits, and the quiet disappearance of men who might have known too much. What makes the case so disturbing is not only the content of the documents, but the deliberate suppression of their aftermath. If former Nazi operatives were indeed reactivated by Soviet handlers, then the early Cold War was not simply East versus West, but a collision of old enemies repurposed for new wars. The story ends in silence, with archives sealed, reels missing, and officials unwilling to confirm what was discovered in Vienna in 1947. For the city itself, the ruins have long since been rebuilt, the streets once again crowded with cafes and trams. But beneath the surface lies an unspoken history, a conspiracy written in microfilm and erased in missing files, a shadow operation that neither side wanted to acknowledge. Operation Silver Ash remains buried in the classified layers of the Cold War, its name spoken only in restricted rooms, its existence denied in public, and its truths dissolved into the ash of history. Chapter 5: The Forgotten Trials of Unit 100. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world began to reckon with the enormity of Japan's war crimes. Unit 731, the infamous biological warfare division in Manchuria, became a symbol of atrocity. Yet hidden beneath the notoriety of that name was another unit, scarcely known even among historians. Unit 100, headquartered near Changchun. Where Unit 731 focused on human experimentation, Unit 100 specialized in biological sabotage, targeting livestock, crops, and food supplies with pathogens designed to cripple entire populations. Its mission was to weaponize hunger and disease. When the war ended, its crimes were quietly buried, its officers shielded by political bargains, and its victims erased from the official record. The story of Unit 100 is not one of justice served, but of silence purchased at the dawn of the Cold War. Unit 100, formerly the Kwantung Army's Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department's 2nd Detachment, was created in 1936 under the command of Veterinary Officer Yujiro Wakamatsu. Its location on the outskirts of Changchun provided both isolation and proximity to transport networks. According to surviving Japanese military records, the unit operated under strict secrecy, its compounds disguised as agricultural research stations. Testimonies collected after the war describe vast barns filled with cattle, horses and pigs, animals deliberately infected with anthrax, glanders and rinderpest. The purpose was clear: to develop pathogens that could wipe out the food sources of enemy armies and civilians alike. Chinese villagers living near the compound later recalled strange die-offs in surrounding areas. Horses collapsed in fields, pigs rotted where they stood, and cattle herds disappeared in weeks. According to a report compiled by Soviet investigators in 1946, Unit 100 operatives deliberately released infected animals into rural districts, monitoring the spread of disease. In one case, an entire village's livestock perished within a month, leaving survivors to starve. Witnesses also described trucks arriving at night, unloading crates of glass bottles later found shattered in streams, bottles that may have contained bacterial cultures. The goal was not merely military disruption, but terror, the slow annihilation of populations through hunger and plague. When Soviet forces occupied Manchuria in August 1945, they overran the Unit 100 compound. Reports filed by the Red Army's Military Prosecutor's Office describe laboratories hastily burned, documents destroyed, and staff vanished. Yet some evidence remained: infected animal carcasses, buried containers marked with Japanese characters, and laboratory instruments still stained with biological agents. Dozens of staff members were captured, including veterinarians, chemists, and technicians. According to transcripts preserved in Moscow, many confessed under interrogation to deliberate contamination operations across the Chinese-Soviet border. One Soviet officer described Unit 100's work as a weapon aimed not at soldiers but at nations, designed to erase life from the fields. Yet unlike Unit 731, whose officers were later shielded by American deals, Unit 100's fate took a stranger turn. In December 1949, the Khabarovsk trials convened to prosecute Japanese war criminals involved in biological warfare. Testimony from former Unit 731 staff was presented in detail. By contrast, almost no mention of Unit 100 was made in the proceedings, despite the Soviets having extensive documentation. Analysts later concluded that the omission was deliberate. By suppressing evidence of Unit 100, Moscow reserved the knowledge for its own scientific programs. Indeed, a declassified KGB report from 1951 notes that documents seized from Unit 100, including techniques for the dissemination of animal pathogens, have been secured for state use. American intelligence soon became aware of these omissions. A CIA briefing from 1953, titled Japanese Biological Warfare Assets, acknowledged the existence of Unit 100 and noted its absence from the Tokyo and Khabarovsk trials. The briefing speculated that both Soviet and American authorities were concealing evidence for strategic advantage. It is likely, the report stated, that personnel from Unit 100 have been absorbed into rival programs under conditions of secrecy. Prosecution was avoided to preserve access to expertise. The file concluded with a chilling line: no victims compensated, no accountability pursued. Meanwhile, in Japan itself, the erasure was nearly total. Post-war tribunals held in Tokyo focused on senior government and military leaders. Unit 100 officers, many of whom had returned under assumed identities, were never summoned to testify. Local rumors persisted in Changchun of Japanese staff disappearing in 1946 aboard Soviet convoys, while others were rumored to have reappeared in American custody at Yokosuka. Without official acknowledgement, survivors of the villages targeted by Unit 100 received no recognition, their suffering lost in the shadow of better-known atrocities. The only surviving testimonies come from a handful of Chinese witnesses and scattered Soviet transcripts. One farmer, whose statement was preserved in archives in Harbin, recalled watching soldiers dump powder into a well. Days later, cattle began foaming at the mouth, and his children fell ill. None survived the winter. Another account described strange glass containers buried in riverbanks, their contents seeping into the water. By the time investigators arrived months later, entire communities had been displaced, with famine sweeping through regions already devastated by war. Researchers attempting to piece together the history of Unit 100 faced near insurmountable barriers. Japanese records were systematically destroyed before surrender. Soviet files remain heavily redacted, and American intelligence continues to withhold entire collections under national security exemptions. Even within academic circles, Unit 100 is rarely mentioned. When it is often dismissed as a subsidiary of Unit 731, an afterthought in the larger narrative. Yet the reality, preserved in fragments of testimony, suggests its operations were extensive, its crimes deliberate, and its victims countless. In 1986, a Japanese journalist uncovered personnel rosters in an abandoned Ministry of Agriculture office in Tokyo. The names matched those of suspected Unit 100 members. Several had gone on to prominent careers in post-war veterinary research and academia. Confronted with questions, one retired professor reportedly responded, "I did what was required during the war. Afterwards, I did what was required to survive." His words encapsulated the silence surrounding Unit 100, a silence that endured through decades of Cold War politics. The tragedy of Unit 100 is not only its crimes, but their erasure. Unlike Unit 731, whose horrors eventually emerged in public memory, Unit 100's victims remain nameless, their suffering unacknowledged. Archives show that both superpowers had access to its files, and both chose silence. The Cold War's hunger for knowledge eclipsed the pursuit of justice. Documents were classified, trials sanitized, and entire communities erased from history books. Today, the story of Unit 100 surfaces only in scattered references, academic footnotes, and whispers from declassified archives. But the fragments paint a clear picture. This was a program designed to weaponize famine, to starve nations into submission, and to do so under the veil of agricultural science. Its crimes were real, its victims countless, and its erasure deliberate. In the ledger of war crimes, Unit 100 stands not only as an atrocity, but as a case study in how history can be suppressed when truth becomes inconvenient for victors. The forgotten trials of Unit 100 never took place. No judges heard the testimonies, no sentences were passed, no memorials erected. The story remains locked in sealed files, remembered only by the survivors who carried it in silence. Their voices, faint and fading, remain the last witnesses to a chapter that the world chose to bury. Some truths are not buried because they are forgotten, but because they burn too brightly, searing anyone who tries to hold them. The war ended on paper, but inside secret annexes and coded transmissions, the conflict lingers, unending, echoing through files erased and rewritten. Every sealed archive is a lock meant to keep us safe, or to keep something else from escaping. You've followed whispers into these corridors of silence, but silence itself has a weight, and it presses hardest when you realize what it hides is not gone at all. The shadows do not vanish. They wait, patient, woven into the fabric of every story never told. And when you close this file, when the reels stop turning and the room grows quiet, ask yourself, did you learn what they wanted you to know, or only what they could not afford to lose?